She found the ledger in a feed sack, shoved behind a shelf in a barn that hadn't been used in 20 years. It was covered in dust so thick she had to wipe it with her sleeve just to see the cover. The leather was cracked, the corners were soft with age, and for a moment she almost put it back exactly where she found it. But something made her open it. Inside were numbers, rows and rows of them, written in pencil, page after page, in handwriting so small and careful it looked almost like a code. Corn prices, vet bills, seed costs, notes about the weather, her grandmother's handwriting. 30 years of it, in one worn little book. She almost closed it right there and set it aside with the rest of the boxes. Then she turned to the very last page. And the last entry in that ledger wasn't about money at all. Her name was Callie Reyes. She was 38 years old, and until that spring, she had never spent more than a weekend at her grandmother's farm. Her grandmother Ruth had passed away in March, quietly, in her sleep, in the same farmhouse she had lived in for 51 years. Callie's mother had died young, almost 15 years earlier. So it was Callie, alone, who drove 3 hours out to Cutler County to clean out the house Ruth left behind. She packed a bag for a weekend. She ended up staying for 6 weeks. She expected old furniture, boxes of photographs, maybe some paperwork and a little debt. She did not expect secrets. The farm itself was small, 80 acres, mostly soybeans, with a barn that leaned a little to the left and a fence line that hadn't been fixed in years. The house smelled like cedar and old coffee. Every drawer Callie opened held something that had clearly not been touched in a decade. Neighbors said Ruth kept to herself. They said she was stubborn, private, the kind of woman who waved from her porch every morning, but never once invited anyone inside for more than a cup of coffee. Callie had always assumed that was simply her grandmother's way. Quiet, guarded, a woman shaped by a hard life on hard land. She didn't know yet how wrong that assumption was. The ledger sat on the kitchen table for 2 full days before Callie opened it again. She almost threw it into the donation pile without looking twice. But on the 3rd night, unable to sleep in a house that still smelled like someone who had just left the room, she sat down and read it slowly, page by page. At first, it was exactly what it looked like. Farm expenses, weather notes, a short line about a frost in 1994 that killed half the soybean crop. Ordinary, practical. Ruth through and through. But somewhere around the year 2003, the entries changed. Small amounts of money started disappearing every single month. $50, sometimes $100, always on the same day of the month, always with no explanation written beside them, just one letter, small and careful, in the margin, the letter T. Callie stared at that letter for a long time. She didn't know anyone in her grandmother's life whose name started with T. Not a friend she remembered. Not a relative anyone had ever mentioned. Not one single person from 50 years of family stories. For 3 straight years, the same amount left the farm's account every single month. And every single month, that one small letter appeared beside it, like a signature Ruth was too afraid to finish writing. Then, just as strangely as it began, the payments stopped. The entries went quiet again for almost a decade after that. Callie almost let the mystery go. She told herself it was probably nothing. An old debt, maybe. A neighbor Ruth used to quietly help out during hard years, the way farm families sometimes do. But farmers do not forget where every single dollar goes. not women like Ruth, who wrote down the price of one bag of seed like it mattered as much as a mortgage payment. If Ruth wrote it down, it mattered. So Callie kept reading. And near the back of the ledger, tucked between two ordinary pages about grain prices, she found a folded piece of paper that didn't belong there at all. It was a letter, not written by Ruth, written to her. The paper was thin and yellowed, folded into fourths so many times the creases had gone soft. Callie's hands were shaking a little as she opened it. The letter was dated 18 years earlier. No return address, just Ruth's name at the top, a date, and a few short lines that Callie read 3 times before her mind fully caught up with what she was looking at. The letter was from a woman who said she was sorry, a woman who said she had thought about this every single day for years, and finally worked up the courage to write, a woman who signed the letter with 2 words, "Your daughter." Callie sat back in her chair and didn't move for a long time. Her mother had been Ruth's only child. That was what she had always been told. That was what every single person in the family had always said, without exception, for as long as she could remember. But this letter wasn't from her mother. It was from someone else. Someone Callie had never once heard mentioned. Not at Thanksgiving, not at a funeral, not in 50 years of family stories told around that same kitchen table. Someone who called Ruth Mom. Over the next few weeks, Callie did what anyone in her position would do. She started asking questions. She talked to an old neighbor, a man named Harold, who had lived next to Ruth for almost 40 years and still drove past the farm twice a week out of habit. At first, Harold didn't want to talk about it. He looked down at his hands and said some things were better left where they were. But Callie waited. She didn't push. And eventually, sitting on his porch with a glass of tea going warm and untouched in his hand, Harold told her the truth. Before Ruth married Callie's grandfather, before any of the life Callie knew about had even started, Ruth had a daughter she gave up when she was very young, unmarried, and completely alone, in a town that did not forgive women for such things back then. The girl was raised by another family 2 counties over. Ruth never told anyone, not her husband, not the daughter she raised afterward, not one living soul for over 50 years. She carried it entirely alone. The payments in the ledger, the ones marked with a single letter T, were money Ruth sent quietly every single month to a woman named Teresa, her firstborn daughter, the one nobody in the family ever knew existed. Callie sat with that for a long time after Harold finished talking. She thought about her grandmother sitting alone at that same kitchen table, every month for 3 straight years, writing out a small check to a daughter she was never allowed to raise, then marking it in a private ledger with nothing but a single letter, because even in her own handwriting, meant for no one else's eyes, she was still too afraid to write the whole name. It wasn't a fortune. It wasn't buried treasure. It wasn't the kind of secret that changes a bank account overnight. It was something heavier than money. It was 50 years of silence, carried alone in a farmhouse kitchen by a woman everyone thought they understood completely. Callie found Teresa 2 months later. She was 71 years old, living in a small house 3 hours away, and when Callie showed up at her door holding an old feed sack, Teresa seemed to know exactly what it was before Callie said a single word. They sat on Teresa's porch for 4 hours that afternoon. Teresa told her that Ruth had reached out once, years ago, out of nowhere, and the two of them had written letters back and forth in secret for almost 3 years. Ruth sent a little money whenever she could, not because Teresa needed it desperately, but because it was the only way Ruth knew how to say the things she never once let herself say out loud. "I'm sorry. I never stopped thinking about you. I never stopped loving you, even from a distance I chose out of fear." The letters stopped the year Ruth's husband got sick, money got tight, and the farm needed every dollar it had. Ruth, ashamed and terrified of being discovered after all those years, quietly ended the one connection she had left with the daughter she had given up as a young woman. Teresa never heard from her again until now, until a granddaughter she never knew existed showed up on her porch, holding a piece of her mother's whole hidden life inside an old feed sack. Before Callie left Teresa's porch that first day, Teresa asked her one quiet question. She asked if Ruth had ever seemed sad in the years Callie had known her, if there had been a look on her face sometimes that nobody could quite explain. Callie thought about it for a moment. She remembered summers as a little girl, watching her grandmother stand at the kitchen window some evenings, staring out toward the road for no reason at all, saying nothing until someone called her name, and she turned around like she was waking up from somewhere far away. Callie had never once asked her about it. Nobody had. Teresa nodded slowly when Callie described it, like the answer confirmed something she had wondered about for 50 years, but never dared to say out loud. They talked for 2 more hours that day, past the point where either of them was really talking about the ledger at all. By the time Callie drove home that night, the sun was already down, and the whole way back she kept thinking about how many quiet evenings her grandmother must have stood at that window, missing a daughter nobody else even knew to look for. Callie went back to the farm one last time before she finally sold it. She stood in the kitchen where her grandmother had sat for 50 years, writing down every single dollar that came in and every dollar that went out, along with one name she was never quite brave enough to fully write. She didn't sell the ledger. She kept it, wrapped carefully in cloth, at the top of her closet. And she gave Teresa one more thing that had been hidden in that same feed sack. A small silver locket, tarnished with age, holding a single tiny photograph inside. A photograph of a baby, taken the day before Ruth gave her up for good. Teresa had never once seen it before in her entire life. She held it in her hands on that porch and cried for a woman she barely remembered, but had never once stopped missing. Not really, not fully, not in 71 years. Some families keep their history in photo albums, passed down and labeled with careful little notes. Ruth kept hers hidden in a feed sack, tucked behind a shelf in a barn nobody used anymore, written down in nothing but numbers, because numbers were the only language she ever fully trusted with the truth. Sometimes the most powerful stories in an old farmhouse are not about money at all. They are about the things people carry quietly for their entire lives without ever putting them into words. And they are about the family members who finally, years later, find the courage to carry those same things forward. If this story moved you even a little, and you want more real stories about the families, the secrets, and the land that shaped them for generations, subscribe to Forgotten Farm Tales. There are more stories like this one waiting for you.